skills in the field 15 pages. I really think of myself as a pop singer who then read quite a lot of books, and that's about it really. But it's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to be in Durham, in this marvellous city, which I love very much and which has quite a bit of personal history for me. So, it's a delight to be giving this lecture in honour of Michael Vasey, whom I greatly respected for the way he held a thoughtful and scholarly approach to liturgy, together with a practical concern for its performance in actual worship. And those two things, it's very easy for them to get separated. He always wanted liturgy that had doctrinal integrity and kept historical continuity with the Christian faith. If you like, he liked a correctness about it. And he also rightly wanted liturgy to reflect a kind of beauty, although I don't mean by that a florid decoratedness. That's not really what he was about. But in the classical sense of the parts being arranged in right proportion to each other, so they make a coherent whole. Now, integrity, continuity, and beauty are pretty hard to deliver all at the same time, as those who serve on liturgical commissions know so well. But together with both of these, Michael also had this passion for liturgy to be approachable, accessible if you like, not only for those already familiar with church, but for the outsider, the person exploring along the edges of faith. He wanted people to be able to walk into a church and, at some level at least, to get it. And I've always thought there was some resonance here with the more controversial area of his work, in calling the church to reassess homosexuality from a Christian point of view. At one level, that seems to be a completely different subject from liturgy, and yet in both of those areas, it seems to me that a theology of hospitality was a strong undercurrent to all that he did. And it's often floated through my mind that the title of his 1995 book, Strangers and Friends, would actually make a very good title for a book on liturgy. It's this matter of making liturgy and worship approachable for the outsider as well as the insider that I want to consider tonight, and in particular whether it's possible to experiment in liturgy and still pay due attention to doctrinal integrity, historical continuity, and a concern for the beauty of form. And those of you who know me know that I am an inveterate liturgical experimenter. I could tell you many stories of experiments that have failed. I shall, of course, tell you the ones that are good, but you can ask me about the failures too. It's the nature of experimentation that you have to be willing to fall on your face, otherwise it's not really an experiment. But I propose to look at this by looking at two very recent ideas in liturgical theory, and then offer you some examples of liturgical experiments I've taken part in. And then return to the idea that the theology of hospitality is the thread that holds all of these things together. I'm sure it's not news to anybody that the numbers of churchgoers drops with every decade, and we deceive ourselves if we think that this is not a problem. In the 2011 census, in 5 local authorities, more than 50% of people under 25 reported having no religious affiliation at all. I hardly need to quote statistics to persuade you there's a problem with the not connecting with culture, but the difficulty is to know how to close the gap. There certainly have been valiant attempts to join the dots between the practice of worship and the culture in which we live. And I've often heard people ask the question, well, how do we make church more relevant? Some mission groups in the late 70s and the 1980s made a point of worshipping in public, on street corners and in marketplaces, muddling together several ideas about taking worship outside the building and about creating a tangible sense of God's presence in a public space. I dare say all of this had some impact on certain individual lives, but it didn't actually produce the Wesleyan-style revival that its leaders were hoping for, and it did little to reverse the decline in church attendance. A more recent model is the seeker-friendly service, which began at Willow Creek in the United States and was then copied in various ways on both sides of the Atlantic. The idea here was that worship could be made so attractive, so accessible to the unchurched, that by attending the services, seekers would become fully fledged believers. To create the attractional model, all those who took part had to be able to lead or sing or read,
or preach to a very high standard indeed, such that it was, in fact, attractive and not homespun or clunky. But in order to achieve that, a sense of community participation was sacrificed. And further, in order to be constantly accessible to visitors, the content of the worship was rather shallow. There were plenty of critics of the seeker service who said that it bought too closely into the entertainment industry. And others suggested that it is conceptually impossible for a seeker to worship in any case. So if the majority of the congregation are seekers, are they just there watching other people worship? And if so, what's that all about? But eventually the demise of the seeker service came about not through the failure of the idea, but because people voted with their feet. And interestingly, it was not the seekers who left. It was the long-term, committed Christian worshippers. One after another, they walked away and reported, "There is just nothing there to feed me," or "I need real depth, not just the same introductory level week after week." So rather than starting with the question, what can we do to make church more relevant, perhaps we should attend to a prior question. Who are the people who are leaving the church, and why do they leave? Alan Jameson's study, he's done sustained research over 15 years and has looked at patterns of faith in church leaders. The majority of those in his studies who left church reported that they were not fringe members, not seekers, but long-term committed believers. And not only that, but their reason for leaving church was not a loss of faith, actually, but their reason for leaving church was that the system had seemed to drain away from them the faith that they had. The demands made on them were for more time, more money, more commitment, more meetings, more regularity of attendance, and the rewards that they got were not an enrichment of spirit, but a draining of the soul. The worship was not sustaining, it was actually boring, and they felt disengaged by it. A few of these from evangelical churches went on to liturgical churches and found some sustenance in a liturgy that allowed them to attend without any demands being made on them. But others reported that there was a level of boredom at just sitting through church, which they couldn't handle. Now, interestingly, and possibly more worryingly, Jameson also identifies what he calls internal leaders. These are people who stay long after the lights have gone out in their own soul. They continue to show up at church, but they have actually internally disengaged. And so you might say they've spiritually left the building, even though physically they still come. Some of those in Jameson's studies who have actually left church physically have reported that having left, they then lost their faith altogether. But interestingly, a substantial number continue with their faith, but outside the institutions of the church. Curiously then, when we consider the role of liturgy in promoting spiritual life, we can't assume that those who come to church are okay and those who don't are disconnected. The picture is in fact more complex than that. But a further layer of complexity emerges if you go and read all the literature that is available on the growth of these new, small, independent church groups. They're named in various different ways, for instance, as emerging, alternative, missional, urban monastic, or intentional Christian community, and there are other names too. Such groups are often peopled by former members of institutional churches, and they meet in homes, coffee shops, pubs, community buildings, and the like. They are typically groups of 12 to 20 people, where their main interest is to create a very connected sense of Christian community, to uphold ecologically sensitive lifestyles and practices, and in some cases, to write and observe their own rule of life. But what's interesting is that in all the documentation about them, and there is now quite a lot of it, there's sociological studies, theological studies, personal memoirs, apologies for community identity, and so on, only a tiny proportion of what's written is actually about worship. So among all the practices of these groups that have left church to keep their faith alive, very little is being said or practiced that has to do with worship. Now, it's my contention that those from the liturgical traditions actually have immense riches to offer to such groups of de-churched Christians and unchurched spiritual explorers. And if we are able to manage all the pieces, we might find ourselves uniquely placed to become the home of just such emerging and alternative communities. But only, I think, if we allow ourselves permission to play a little bit with the liturgical riches that we have. For this, I want to turn to Mark Pearson. In The Art of Curating Worship, Pearson says the answer to the church's problems with worship doesn't lie in greater creativity or better music or more relevance or a better understanding of culture or even of the arts. The solution lies in asking better questions. For Pearson, asking better questions means actually refusing to ask how to make it relevant, and instead to ask how to command and disseminate the riches we have so that people can gain access to them, without any expectation that they have to get it right or obey the rules when they do. And for this he offers the worship leader the metaphor of curator as a different way of conceptualising what we do when we handle the stuff of worship. Unlike the theory behind the seeker service, Pearson spends no time considering relevance and no time tweaking liturgies and forms of worship to make them accessible in the sense of being dumbed down for visitors. Instead, he goes in the opposite direction, asking people to think bigger about worship. You have something remarkable to give away, says Pearson, and the visitor is plenty clever enough to grasp it. What matters is not dumbing it down, but how do you frame it? Another of his themes is the segue, the connection between all the pieces of liturgy, so that people don't switch off or get turned off between the parts of liturgy. And he suggests that even walking from the car park to the building is a segue. It's a connection between two things that happen. Now, worship leaders, he suggests, function in many roles. The MC, the pastor, the rock star, the preacher, the evangelist, the musical director, the youth worker, and so on. And most of these involve a considerable amount of time standing at the front while everybody else is arranged like an audience around you. But imagine what the curator of an art exhibition does. She or he will study and then organise the pieces in a collection and present them sympathetically, with the right amount of space between them, nicely framed on the right wall, and with just enough information to give people the clues they need to approach the pieces and make the connections between them, with just enough enticement to take them from the first room to the second, but not so much that you're overwhelmed. It takes an expert, actually, to do that. This is not for the faint-hearted. And I'm pleased about that, because having spent a great deal of time in theological education, it would be a shame to think it was wasted. Curators also, of course, borrow from other collections, borrowing items that enhance the viewer's understanding of their home collection. But, and this is the point that Pearson nails so brilliantly, on the day of the exhibition, when it opens, the curator may be the tour guide, the curator may be the person who introduces the exhibition, but it is just as likely that the curator will be completely invisible. The curator often just vanishes into the crowd, or even goes off to their office to plan the next exhibition. If the work of curation is done well, then the work of the tour guide is far less necessary on every occasion. Pearson's vision, then, is that by rethinking how we conceive of ourselves as worship leaders, and how we manage and present the riches we have in the Christian tradition, we might engage in liturgy that looks different from what we're used to, but rather than being dumbed down, it's even more challenging, both for the regular churchgoer and for the visitor. It's a vision that sheds the over-clericized church, it sheds the tyranny of liturgical rules that must be obeyed at all costs, and instead there's permission to play intelligently with the riches of liturgy as life-giving gift. Maybe we underestimate what we have if we think that visitors won't want or won't understand what we have. And certainly the way that we present and offer what we have is wide open for improvement. But what we don't have to do is somehow make it relevant for modern society. Michael Vasey himself pointed out that part of the problem with modern church is that it has unconsciously bought into the modern project. Rather than making ourselves more modern to appeal to modern people, he said, we might consider recovering the medieval version of heaven, one that's marked by celebration and festival, almost to the extent of having a kind of campness about it. Heaven in the medieval vision, said Vasey, had more in common with a gay pride march than it did with the sober political discourse or the leisure-wear informality of much of our religion. One more question before I show you some examples. If the worship leader curates, what does everybody else do? Shannon Crago-Snell has just recently, about 2 weeks ago, brought out this incredible new book. You can rush out and buy it, it's fantastic. And she brings the language of theatre to the church and to the current problems with liturgy and the empty church. But she brings the language of theatre not in the sense of the congregation watching the performers through a fourth wall. Rather, she takes ideas from performance theory and uses them to emphasise that liturgy is performed by the whole body of people. Performance theory develops the idea that what we do and say and enact on a regular basis and repeated reinforces through our behaviour what we actually become. Rather than saying then that I am a Christian, as if that is a state of being, she would say that I am constantly becoming Christian. Rather than saying we go to church, she would describe church as event, something that happens each time we enact it, and as we do, we become church. Crago-Snell's appeal is actually for the renewal of traditional church, but I think that something of this sensibility is at work in the small independent Christian groups that don't identify themselves with the mainstream any longer. The constant enactment of community, of a lifestyle that's congruent with belief, is creating a strong sense of community identity that is satisfying and engenders sustainable commitment. But put together the idea of curated worship and the performativity of enacted event, and the suggestion emerges that the liturgical tradition could function as both a springboard and a frame for worship in a far broader and more experimental capacity than we have yet imagined. I think that making the connection between tradition and revolutionary experiment is very important. Rather than saying we're going to experiment, let's wipe the slate clean and start again, we experiment out of the rubble of what went before. This protects us from the thing that most liturgists and theological educators fear the most, that kind of vague, doctrine-free, do-it-yourself therapy worship, which makes people feel better, but is really nothing more than a narcissistic reflection of themselves. But I put it to you that experimenting with liturgy doesn't have to mean cutting loose from tradition or liturgical form or doctrinal orthodoxy. And you can see here what Stravinsky said, I love this, quote, real tradition is not the relic of a past that's irretrievably gone, it's a living force that anticipates and informs the present. I think the other kind is not really tradition, it's traditionalism of a different kind of a thing. Let me give you then some examples of taking liturgical riches outside the church structure, and then some examples of bringing the best of those experiments back inside the building. I went to visit my friend Martin Poole, who is ordained in the Church of England and is one of the most innovative thinkers that the Church of England has, in my humble opinion. We were walking up and down the Brighton seafront, discussing how you can take worship outdoors and how to connect church with the wider community. And then he did one of those lateral thinking things that creative people sometimes do. He sort of turned around and seemed to be just off topic somehow. And he stood looking at the huts, and then he said to me, what does that look like to you? So I looked at Martin, I thought, well, cogs are turning here, let's just wait a moment. And then he said, imagine them, in the dark, in December, opened up one at a time. It was like a life-sized advent calendar. How exciting would that be? Now, I don't know if you know Brighton, but just like the beaches at this end of the country, the only people who actually go and walk on them in December, in the dark, at 6 o'clock in the evening, especially if it's raining, are people who have a dog to walk. Everybody else, if we've got any sense, is at home or going home or down the pub. All the same, it was an intriguing idea, and by the end of the summer, Martin had put a note under every one of the 400 plus beach huts, asking whether owners would be willing to collaborate with local artists, creating an installation, one night, each day of December. By December we had 24 huts, each prepared to open on a different night, only one per night, you understand, and 24 artists who converted those huts into installations based on Christmas carols. Although I lived in London, went down for quite a lot of these, and we took mulled wine and mince pies and a music box to play carols as people came to visit. That was a rather lovely one, sort of great big lights and everything. Now at first there was quite a small turnout. Actually that's big compared to the first one. At the beginning it was maybe half a dozen and a couple of dog walkers who stopped for a glass of mulled wine. But some of them came back the next night, and then some of them came back the night after that. And every now and then we'd sing, and Martin would say a few words about why we were there and what the real meaning of Christmas is. And we would tell people they were welcome and this was our community and which hut we were going to be at the next night. Eventually we got a bit of local press interest and then some national press interest. And so the turnout grew a little, enough at least to warrant doing it another year. By the third year of the Advent Beach Hut calendar, an amazing thing had happened. I don't know what you expect people to be doing at 6 p.m. on the 24th of December. It's probably not going down the beach, but an amazing 250 people turned out to come to the beach hut and see what was happening. And Martin, being Martin, he'd organised some circus performers and all kinds of elaborate stuff. Which is great, isn't it? But here's the question, is it liturgy? I knew you were going to ask me that. Let me put it to you that this is a gathered community that returns over and over again. It's a performed act with a response repeated on successive occasions, so it fits Craig Snell's performativity category. The gospel was proclaimed, there was praise. It is, in effect, the elements of liturgy, but curated, Pearson style, with a new frame. So stick that on a shelf in your head and take a look at this. Up the road from there, there's a finger maze in a park in Hove. The finger maze is a labyrinth, but it's sort of the shape of a fingerprint, artistically stylised. And being a labyrinth, once you've started into it, you can't reach a dead end. You just keep going, and eventually you just automatically get to the middle. And some of the same group of people who'd been to the beach huts came to this. We told the people we knew that this was going to happen on a Sunday afternoon, and some people showed up. So we had a gathering. The use of a local landmark in a public place started to be reinvested with a little Christian meaning. And again, some random passers-by came and joined in. Along with the performativity element of this, and I should tell you that what happened was we gave people, why it's orange all over the place, is we gave people balls of wool in all the colours, orange, red, pink, yellow, colours of fire basically, and asked them to string out this wool behind them as they walked. It proved quite difficult to do, so it slowed people down, and that was a good thing because it gave them time to walk the labyrinth very thoughtfully. And then there was a kind of disruption of expectation. We'd given everybody a little MP3 player and some earpods to wear while they went round. And we made a soundtrack for this a few days beforehand. The soundtrack went something like this. Verse of Bible reading, followed by an idea. Have a little think about this, or try walking very aware of your feet touching the ground as you walk. Think about the way your body is part of your prayer, those kinds of things. And so we wanted two voices alternating. So me and Martin sat down, and we started off with him reading the scriptures and me giving the instructions. And then there'd be a little space with ambient music. And then we'd do it again. And then we listened to it, and Martin said, well, the problem with that is it sounds like, the voice of God is male, and we're trying to make a bit of variation of that. So why don't we flip it over and try it the other way around? You do the scriptures and I'll do the instructions. So we tried that, and he listened to it again. He said, yeah, but then I'm giving instructions, and people don't like, just being bossed around by bossy white men. So there's something we need to do here. And he said, I'm not sure what it is, it just doesn't feel right. At which point my son, who was about 9 or 10 at the time, wandered through the kitchen looking for milk or something. And Martin said, well, he's good at reading, isn't he? So, yeah, okay. So we asked him if he would have a go at this. He proved actually to be really very good at voiceover work, so I think there might be a whole career there. And so he read the scriptures And I read the instructions, and when we listened back, I mean, we were just about on the verge of tears, because it's the voice of God in the voice of a 10-year-old boy, a soprano voice. And it was so disruptive of what you expect that even before we got to the fingernails, we were quite rapt with it. So anyway, we gave this to people, and so that was an amazing thing. And then people walked around, and we stuck this piece of fallen down tree in the middle and made it stand up. And when we got to the end, everybody gathered up all the wool that was spread all over the fingernails, brought it to the middle, and we ended up with this amazing thing. And fortunately for us, the sun came out, we had ourselves a burning bush. So Martin jumps up to the middle, preaches a little sermon about holy ground, and we have this lovely mixture of, beach hut community and random passers-by and everybody doing a little holy ground thing. And then we just left it there for a few days without explanation. We just thought, well, we'll leave it. So that's what we did. We then got the bottom of a basement of a hotel and did a tenebrae service in which we took all of the icons of Holy Week, all of the symbols and the stuff that you would encounter in Holy Week, but put them in a different sort of building. And curiously, just by displacing them, it looked different. So these brick and concrete little shelves were actually an old wine cellar, and each of these would have had wine holders in. And so we just filled up all these little holes around the walls with icons and symbols of Holy Week. We candle-lit the whole room, and then by some miracle got permission from Health and Safety to actually turn all the lights off, which is really hard to achieve. Health and Safety, I mean. And then we blew out the candles one by one. And unlike any church I've ever been in, it actually was pitch black. It was a gasp moment. It was quite wonderful. So those are some things we did outside church. Let me then say, well, what happens if you bring it back to church? Is that possible? This is St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle, which I think you may well have heard of. The Compline service there is quite famous. St. Mark's, Seattle, if you've not been there, is right on the top of a hill, and it's in a residential area where you have to be seriously rich to live. And all of the houses are quite some distance, because then they have a bit of land as well. So you've got huge houses and a cathedral, and there's no shopping area, there's no community around it. So they have to reach out quite far to get their community. But down at the bottom of the same hill, there's a little gathering point under a sort of bridgey, viaducty type thing. And there young people gather to drink tins of beer and hang out and socialise and maybe deal a little bit and stuff like that. And so what the cathedral did was send a bus down and invited young people. I said, we're doing this lovely sun service. You might find it's a bit like a chill-out room, which at the time would have sounded like a cool thing. And so a minibus of people went up the hill. The next week they needed 2 buses. And then this became a regular thing, and they had to send out quite a lot of transportation and filled up the cathedral. Nothing about the liturgy changed from the point of view of the ministers and the choir. Still they had a robed choir, still they sang in Latin, beautiful Compline settings. But what they did change was what they required of the people who attended. You don't have to sit on a pew, or you can lie on one if you want to, or you can lie down all over the labyrinth mat, and you can just let it wash over. This became a really established community with a kind of character all of its own. Well, I was inspired by that, and when I was serving as the chaplain to King's College, I was given the brief that I should get the students into chapel. Now, I truly did not deliberately misunderstand the brief. I really did think what they meant was, we want you to get the students into the chapel. What they actually meant was, we want you to make the students come to Evensong. But that somehow went over my head, I don't know why. And I could have told them they won't come, because I just knew that. But I did think, well then how do I get the students, most of whom have no interest in chapel, most of whom not only have no interest in chapel, but are kind of prejudiced against it because they think what happens in there is it's full of tourists and people singing posh music, and that's not what we want to do. So I put out some adverts and said the next 4, whatever it was, Wednesday nights at 10 o'clock in the evening for 1 hour, There will be no tourists. The chapel will only be open to students of this college. And you can come and de-stress from your exam, nightmare stuff. And it's not a religious service, it is just time for you to enjoy your chapel space. All over the chapel I sprinkled things like little instructions on how to lie on your back and completely relax, which of course has nothing really to do with Christianity exactly, it's just a thing, how do you relax? You can connect it or not as you like. But I also put things like scripture verses and ancient prayers and Julian of Norwich's little thing about all shall be well and stuff like that. And I just put these all over the chapel, some in a side chapel with jazz and chocolate and marshmallows, and then at the other end, so far away that you can't hear the jazz, a silent room where you could just completely turn off everything and be silent. Well, I was hoping I might get a dozen. 60 people showed up. After an hour they didn't want to leave and I had to kick them out. And the week after that I got 90 and the week after that I had 120. There was unfortunately no mass revival that followed, and they did not all come to Evensong, although just one did. But over the following 12 months I started a little alternative worship community across the road at St Edward's, which I called Ambient Mass. That later morphed into the Goth Eucharist, and it still continues today under the expert guidance of Malcolm Guite, whom some of you will know. But what I can tell you is that 6 students got baptised that year, and 2 of them got married to each other and then brought their kids to be baptised. And a number of them came to me and said, how is it that we have so much food in King's College and there are homeless people in the markets, but we need to do something about that. So we started setting up a feed the homeless kind of arrangement. So there was something going on, for sure. Ambient Mass was a learning experience for me. Because as you can imagine, if you do this kind of experimental worship, it's pretty labour intensive. First thing you have to do is come up with the idea, that's even the hard bit. But then once you've got the idea, there's getting the stuff and putting it ready and cutting things up and getting bits of stuff to stand up and things like that. So it's a lot of work. And I wanted to do Ambient Mass every week. And I thought, I don't think I can do this every week. I can't generate that much creative energy and still go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. So it occurred to me then that part of the beauty of liturgy is that, part of the beauty of liturgy is that it is the same and it cuts a groove into you. That's its function. But part of its beauty is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But I was working with a group that didn't want a prayer book. So I took several versions of the Mass, including the Latin Tridentine, and created a communion service that had all the right pieces in an order that made sense and was congruent with tradition, in a language that made sense to my congregation. And we then had the freedom to play a bit with the different parts of the service, offering wordless intercessions, for instance, by doing this kind of thing with pictures of Cambridge, one after another, but not saying any words. I've also put up there the 5-minute Mass, which was a very, very, very reduced version. I had a little challenge because on feast days in my next college, which was Robinson, people would come back to college for lunch and they'd have about 40 minutes before they then had to get on their bikes and go back again to their lectures. On a feast day, if I was going to hold the Eucharist, it would take them at least 35 of the 40 minutes. And they also had to get their lunch, and I knew which one was going to win. So I thought, well, how do I create something that is suitable for a feast day and can still, get their lunch, so they will come to chapel? So I created the 5-minute Mass, which in truth actually takes 7 minutes. It's just that doesn't sound so good. So, but that includes a 90-second homily, which I think is pretty good. And every part of the Mass is there in the right order. If you read it and you were a skilled liturgist, or even just a regular churchgoer, you may well read it and think, oh, wait a minute, there's something missing here, it's annoying me. But it was an experiment. Whether it succeeded or failed, I can't tell you. People came to chapel, so that mattered to me. I've taken the wordless intercessions back to real chapel. Last year, in my current chapel at Yale, we put out these large strips of fabric on the side of our church and our chapel. And when it came to intercession time, we asked everybody to get up, take a Sharpie and write their prayer on the fabric. And then at the offertory, the students who were helping me lead this service wove all the pieces of fabric together on the communion table, at the end of which the prayers became the communion tablecloth. And afterwards people said, it was brilliant, because it really felt as if we'd taken our prayers to communion and the whole thing kind of came together. So that was just a very simple idea. But then the silent thing, and I'll tell you one more of these before I close. I wondered whether it was possible to have a wordless sermon. Isn't that, contradiction in terms? There are some preachers here, I'm sure of it. Can you do a wordless sermon? Well, I met this man, Andrew Nimmer. He is an outstanding tap dancer, really, world class, and he was trained and mentored by Gregory Hines, if that means anything to you. He's like a stunning, world class dancer. So I talked to Andrew and I said, is it possible to dance a sermon? Is that going to work or not? And he said, I like that idea, let's work on it and see what we can come up with. So we thought we'd go for it, and the theme was the still small voice, so it seemed to work as, what are we listening for? Are we listening to big loud bangs and lots of words, or are we listening to the wrong thing? And so at first we thought, we'll have the wordless sermon, we'll just have the reading, and then he can get up and dance. And they're clever people at Yale, surely they'll get it. And then as we looked at the liturgy we laid out, we began to think, I don't know if they are going to get it. I think they're going to sit there for 5 minutes waiting for the sermon and wondering what the illustration is for. So we went back to it, and again, I went to Mark Pearson's idea of framing. So I said to Andrew, how do we frame this? Without me getting up and explaining what it's about, which would just take the gas right out of it. Without me telling them what you're going to dance. Without even presuming that you can explain it. How can I just frame this, very briefly, with just enough words? And I went back to the art gallery idea, the little postage stamp that gives you just the clue to tell you what you're looking for. So I gave a 90-second introduction to his dance, which basically framed the idea that we come to a sermon listening for words, and maybe what we need to listen for is all the stuff in the spaces in between. And I ended up with a couple of questions that said, what if God speaks to us in, what if, and just left the question hanging in the air. And then I went and sat down, and he got up and danced. And here's what happened. First, I think there was a little scepticism in the room. I could feel that. You know how you can. And a bit of curiosity too. But every moment that went by, and because this works because he was such a brilliant dancer, he dances on this little board that's about half the size of this table, and he takes it with him because, tap shoes scratch the floor out. So he danced round and round and round his board, and he danced on the edges of it and across the middle. And as he danced, it was like every moment, it felt as if the room got bigger. There was an extraordinary thing. You could swear that the room was like a TARDIS. It was growing as he danced. Now, the things I've shown you may, on the surface, not look much different from the kinds of therapy-style gatherings that theological educators worry about so much, because I'm one of those myself, so I count myself in that. But I think they are liturgy and not therapy. I think even they might be better liturgy than sometimes we do in church, because it's participatory and it's performed by the community and it's engaged, and it can all be traced back to the tradition. It's not rows of individuals sitting in a room, it's really community-shaped. We come to God, not I. And there is a proper sense in which we expect God to meet us, not on therapy terms, but with relationship. In fact, underlying the idea of Eucharist, the theology, not the practice of it, not what you do with the bread and wine, but underneath the idea of the Eucharist, there is a theology of hospitality, which, of course, Andrei Rublev so beautifully showed in his icon. The Trinity sitting around the table and the empty space, which is the invitation for us simply to join in with what's happening. But as well as hospitable, this then offers us the idea that when we go to worship God, we shouldn't worry too much about therapy, because in fact it is absolutely congruent with the Christian tradition that when we go to worship we will get something. Of course we'll get something, and we should expect to. because that's the nature of God. If God in kenosis is self-giving, giving away the self without any actual loss of identity, then we should expect to get something. It's just that it's not that narcissistic reflecting back of myself to myself. It's something on a far deeper level. So I suggest then that as liturgists we need to learn to sit light to correctness, to hold orthodoxy but to hold it lightly in our hands and not grasp it so tightly that it kills the spirit. And in that spirit I want to close with one more story about Michael Vasey. This one was told by Michael Perrin. The two Michaels were among the group that was in the midst of bringing the liturgical commission towards some final decisions on common worship. And at that stage, when compromises for the sake of a decision seemed to take precedence over the work done thus far, Michael Vasey one day exploded with frustration, I am told, commenting that our problem is that we are Laudianising the liturgy of the Church of England, which Michael Perrin took him to mean that he believed the group was looking for a kind of liturgical uniformity that was long on the beauty of holiness and on order and on cathedral style and on good taste, but rather short on the kind of imagination that allows for experimentation and local colour. An overexerted concern then for correctness, I think, stops liturgy from doing its proper work. Perhaps a perfectly performed liturgy that is more concerned with correctness than anything can actually become unmoored from its historical continuity. For you can actually only be theologically correct if you keep a degree of wildness of spirit, such that we can let the Holy Spirit do her work. The purpose of liturgy is not to tick boxes and get an A grade, but to connect us relationally to God through the Holy Spirit. And so accessibility is not a matter of making it relevant, but of having a confidence in our liturgical history to believe that it will stand up to a bit of playing, that it will connect people to what they're really searching for deep down, and that in the end it rests not on our attempts to present our wares, and not on the necessity of precise correctness, but in fact on the theological principle of the hospitality of God.